By using quality tracks that you know are like well made and work well in the club, you're going to be able to stay on track towards getting your music to that level. Hey guys, Dilby here. I'm in my studio in Berlin. Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me. I've got an awesome video for you today where we're going to talk about referencing, like how to do it, my best tips and tricks, the plugins I use, how to go about it. I find referencing really important to help make sure that you're outputting quality music and getting to that stage as quickly as possible. By using quality tracks that you know are like well made and work well in the club, you're going to be able to stay on track towards getting your music to that level. So before we get into it, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, all of that stuff. You know, it really helps the channel and makes sure that I can keep bringing you these vids. Anyway, enough chit chat, let's get into Ableton and do some referencing. Alright guys, here we are inside Ableton. This is a track that I've been working on. It's kind of at the end of the writing stage and about to get ready to do the mix down. So let's have a quick listen. Cool. And the reference track that I'm going to be using is a track by Gorge from his and Nick Curley's label 8-Bit Records, and it's called Going Back. So we'll take a listen to that. Cool. It's a bit older, but great track. Love that one. So I've got my green tea. Now let's crack on with this project and I'll show you how to do some referencing. So the first thing we want to address is the routing of the reference track. We want to avoid going through the master bus because pretty much every reference track that I use is already mastered. So we don't want to be adding any limiting or EQ or compression on top of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the external output to send that directly to output 1 and 2. So what this is referencing is output 1 and 2 of my audio interface. So that's going to allow us to get the track, the reference track out of Ableton, and it's going to hit directly into the output of the audio interface, bypassing the master bus. The next thing that I do is I have a group of reference tracks. So that's just to save time setting up that routing. All I have to do is duplicate this and then delete it, chuck in a new track, and we're good to go. Then to actually reference an A-B, all I have to do is hit the solo button on the reference track that I want to hear. The next thing that we need to keep in mind is track selection. Now this is really important. We want to make sure that it's like the same genre, but we also want it to be like a similar energy. Would you play it at a similar time of the set? We don't want to be comparing a peak time banger if we're making a warm-up track or vice versa. We also want to make sure that it's got similar elements, like a similar number of elements and similar style of elements. Like we don't want to be comparing a full vocal track if we're writing something that's an instrumental or a dubby kind of thing. So you can see in this track that I've got like the bass, the main chords, I've got an ARP, this organ stab. Right, so it's not exactly the same as the reference track, but the reference track, it's got similar kind of elements. It's got a bass, it's got some chord stabs, a small vocal, this kind of like fast, repetitive synth that's sitting up in the same kind of space as the arpeggio. Now I would also usually use more than one reference track. I'd use like maybe 2 or 3 because it gives you a kind of, it's going to be difficult to get a track that is exactly right for your track. really important thing that we need to do is loudness match our track with the reference tracks. So the reason that we want to match the loudness is because our brains are going to perceive something that is louder to be better. So in order to get an accurate comparison, we need to make sure that they're at a similar loudness. That way we can really compare apples with apples. So the industry standard for loudness is LUFS. I'm not an audio expert in the super technical realm, so I'm just going to read you a definition of what LUFS is. LUFS stands for loudness units full scale, which references loudness units to full scale, i.e. the maximum level a system can handle. In theory, two pieces of audio that register identical LUFS should sound like they're at the same level. So it's not about decibels, it's about volume, it's about the perception of loudness. So what I'll use for checking the loudness is a free plugin from Julian called Loudness Meter 2. Aren't these guys creative with their naming? Okay, so we're getting a short-term reading 8.1 and then an integrated, which is like over a longer period of time, of 8.1 also, because this is kind of the most full part of the track. So let's check on the reference track. Yeah, so that's about the same. It's maybe a tiny bit louder. So what I might do is just bring it down like 0.1 of a dB. So now they should be pretty similar. Cool. The next thing I want to discuss is where you should reference. So what I like to do is I like to go through my reference track, and I'm going to use Command E here to cut that and give it a different color. And I'm going to do this in all of the breakdown sections. The reason I'm doing that is I've got a quick visual guide of the parts where the kick drum comes out, so that I'm not kind of trying to compare bits where the kick drum's going in my track with a piece that the kick drum is filtered in the reference track. You know, just compare apples with apples, basically. So I've got that visual representation, which is great. Another thing that I like to do is I'll just grab this and shift the main break in line. So that way we can easily compare the energy coming out of the breakdown with a track that we're familiar with and that we know works on the dance floor. So like a good section to use as like a general comparison when mixing would be this part here before the breakdown. So this is going to be a part of the track where all the elements are in full power, full energy. That's going to be the case in the reference track and in my track. And that's going to give us a good section to compare. One other thing I like to do is find a part near the beginning where there's less going on. That way we can kind of get a good idea of the relative volume of the main elements, so like the kick drum, the bass line, the main hi-hat, the clap, that type of thing, and then we can kind of compare that to what's going on in our track. Yep, cool. So now I'm going to show you how I set up Voxengo SPAN to use for referencing. First of all, I'll change the color. You'll see why I change the color in a minute. So that's the frequency spectrum that we've got going on in the track. And what I like to do is adjust some of the settings. I'll click this little cog button here, which brings up the settings for the analyzer. What I'm going to do is change the block size to 8192. So the block size is like the resolution, and I've basically got this 8192 setting from someone else. I'll show you what like full resolution looks like. So there's kind of so much information there, and then 64 resolution. So it's like, if you think of it in the EQ, that's 64 bands, and then this is 65,000 bands. The trade-off is like fidelity, like how many bands there are versus like how responsive it is. At 65,000 you could see that it's really unresponsive. 8192 gives us a good compromise of detail and refresh rate. This is still quite chaotic, and there's kind of like too much information there to be able to get a good overview. We're only using this as to get like an overview of what's going on in the track. So I'm going to turn the smoothing on to 1/3 octave, and let's see how that affects it. So that makes it much more easy to kind of to understand what's going on. You can see the hi-hats are happening up here. You can still see that the bass is kind of, you can see when the bass hits that it's pumping down here, and you can see when the kick drum's happening. So it's responsive enough that we can identify different elements in the spectrum, but it's smooth enough that it gives us a more of a broad overview. Now we're going to set up the sidechain input, and we're going to select our reference track, and I'm going to check their pre-effects, just in case there's an EQ or anything like that. We don't want that to be affecting the signal that is going into SPAN. Now, what I'm going to do is hit the routing here. I'm going to select insert 3 and 4, input 3 and 4, and I'm going to go to group names, and I'll change this one to master, and I'll change group 2 to ref. Cool, so we've got that there. That's all we need to do in the routing section. What this now allows us to do is select what we're going to see in the span. So that's actually showing us the reference track. What we do need to do is make the same adjustments so we're comparing, again, apples with apples, right? Change the smoothing 1/3 octave. And I'll change the color of this to red. Now the reason I change it to red is when I use this underlay, it's going to show my track, and then I can underlay the reference track. Now that's where the magic happens, right? So what can we tell by comparing these? Remember, my track is the blue one, and the red one is the reference track. So what I'm going to do here so that's good, but the problem I'm having here is that that's not very good for making a tutorial and discussing how this works. So what I'm going to do is go into the settings again and change this from, instead of real-time average, I'm going to change it to average. So that's just going to create an overall average on an ongoing basis. And I need to do that for the reference. Set that to average. and let's have a look at that. So what we can see from this spectrum now is that my kick drum is a bit quiet. I've got a lot of energy in this really high frequency spectrum, but the main body of the hi-hats is not as loud. The bass line is a similar volume. Now, what I'm kind of getting from this is that the loudness matching that we did wasn't quite perfect. So I'm going to use the gain section here on the sidechain input and just bring that down like 1 dB. Now let's reset that. So I'm going to keep adjusting this gain until my kick drum is the same as the reference track. So what I can now tell from this that we've got build up in the high frequencies of the hi-hats. So what I could do there is throw an EQ8 on there and cut off a bit of that high frequency that we're not really going to hear. And I'm thinking that this probably means my kind of main open hi-hat is not loud enough. That's getting a bit more similar. Now I can also see that my bass line is a bit too loud comparative to the reference track. So I'm going to bring that down, say 3 dB. So I'm not going to go through and adjust everything in this tutorial because we've got a bit to get through, but you can see there how you can get a quick visual reference and make decisions on what to adjust within your track. Obviously you always use your ears to make those adjustments, but it's just like a second level of comparison. So another really handy little freeware plugin that I use is BX Solo from Brainworks, and the reason I use this is to compare mid-side energy with my reference track. So I can just hit the Solo S button, and that's just going to show me the information that's on the sides in my track. Now I go to the reference track, do the same thing. So that way you can get a good understanding of like how much energy there is in the sides as opposed to the mids of the track that you're referencing. Sometimes you'll find that a track with a lot of shakers or something has a lot of energy in the sides, but then if you just solo the mids, you might not hear those shakers at all because they're all pushed out to the sides, which gives them more space in those really high frequencies. So the next thing that is really important for mixing in particular is using a rough mix of your track that you're working on to reference while you're mixing, right? I like to put this at the bottom of my project, that way I know my reference tracks are at the top and my rough mix is at the bottom. Of course, you want to have it going to the external out, not through the master again. And what you want to do is basically just keep checking this. While you're going, so you can be sure that basically you're making improvements. So if you end up doing your mix over multiple sessions, you want to make sure that you export each session and bring in the most recent one, because you want to make sure that the mix moves that you're actually doing are making an improvement, not making the track worse. I've had the situation where you spend all this time mixing and you listen to the before and after and you're like, shit, it was better before. You know, it's really easy to lose your perspective and just keep going, and then you hear that you've just kind of mushed your hi-hats or your bass is way out of control. I've been there, not good. Trust me, use a reference. Alright guys, so that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something from it and it was useful. I should also mention that there's a couple of plugins that are quite interesting that automate some of this stuff, like the loudness matching, and are actually really useful. There's Metric AB from Plugin Alliance and Reference from Mastering the Mix. These are both really good plugins which I'd recommend you check out. Maybe you know of something else that I've missed or that I don't know of. Let me know in the comments. After this vid, jump on over to Instagram and find me. It's @DilbyDJ. I'm posting pretty much every day and I'm really active in my DMs. I love hearing from you guys about how your music production's going and how you're putting these tips into practice. So hopefully I'll hear from you soon. One other thing, the track that's playing and all the title sequences and everything, that's a new one of mine called Work. It's with my bro Nan Solo. It's on Mother Recordings. So I'll leave a link to that in the description. It's out on Beatport, Spotify, all the regular places. Anyway, I've got to go write some music. So I'll catch you next time. Peace. Yeah.